Okay, so let's talk about user interface design. We're going to cover some of the basic principles in user interface design, and this is going to be something that we'll come back to in later parts of the lecture. Now, the basic idea behind user interface design is to cover with design intent every part of the system that a human is actually going to interact with, and it is something you actually have to have a plan for. You can't just do this and expect that having used software you will be able to make usable software. It's an entirely different thing when you're creating rather than simply using. Typically you're going to think of this as very different from the design phase of a system development lifecycle. Design is intended to refer to all of the parts that need to be designed, and user interface design does happen in the design phase, but it is not all that happens in the design phase. So one of the main differences is that you're not going to be looking at interfaces with automated systems. You're not going to be looking at interfaces with databases or APIs or so-called back-end pieces of development. You're mostly looking at human contactable surfaces of your software system. This can be broken down into three parts: the navigation, how you get from one place to another in the application; the input, which is essentially any time somebody is providing any kind of an input to your application; and then the output, anytime you're displaying, printing, reporting, or providing information to a human from the application. Okay, so here are the basic principles in user interface design: layout, awareness, aesthetics, user-focused, consistency, and efficiency. And we're going to go through each of these in some detail, but I want to at least briefly mention one of the concepts that's very popular with people who've come from a CS background as an undergraduate in this course, and that is awareness, because you may have heard of the phrase, "no news is good news." This is a typically terrible piece of advice, but depending upon the user expectation, it can be justifiable, and this is a good example of the general rule for all of these principles. You can break the principle if the expectation is for it to be broken, right? This is true for a lot of user interface questions, but most of the time these principles apply, right? Most of the time you want to pay attention to the basic idea behind these principles and do the best that you can in accommodating for them. Let's talk about layout first. Layout refers to where you place elements on the screen or on the user interface so that users can make use of the application. Probably the biggest mistake here is not making use of white space. If you're throwing every UI widget you can on a single screen, it will overwhelm the user and they will not be able to actually use the application effectively. That said, a lot of other things can be considerations for layout. If you're displaying a list of things, put them in a order that makes sense. If you sort the list so that the first item appears first, it's much easier for a user to use the application. If you have ranges, make sure that the ranges end and begin in reasonable places. If you have graphics, make sure the color, scale, and appropriateness make sense. If you're using a screen that has multiple pages or pagination associated with it, make sure that you are planning the display of information so that it breaks at an appropriate place. Typically with layout you want to start top to bottom and left to right, meaning you'd start in the upper left hand corner up here and then begin laying out from there. Okay. The next thing we want to talk about is content awareness, and I've got a couple of things we'll have to delete here. There we go. All right, so with content awareness, the idea is that you want to give the user some context for what's going on and to generally not let no news be good news, right? We want to avoid that general approach. That said, there are, of course, expectations and instances where you would want no news to be good news. You don't have to prompt the user with an alert box every time something succeeds. Most of the time, it's okay to get by without having to do that. But in cases where the context makes a big difference, prompt the user and tell them what's expected. Tell them as much as you can within reason. And there's a little bit of an art to this, and this is one of the reasons why design is difficult. You can't necessarily just follow a list of principles and then always be, in every circumstance, covered, right? Mostly with content awareness, you want to focus on any important changes to the context, any suggested approaches to solving complex pieces. errors, warnings, that sort of thing. You want to avoid jargon or random error messages. I can show you a couple of examples. Okay, this is actually an error that I had on a Word application that I was working on in the change tracking section. Typically what will happen is you make a change and the author name will appear here, and then the actual content of the change appears here. And in this particular case, I was working on a document and an unknown author had managed to somehow change my application. This is the famous PC Anywhere error loading error messages error, which is hilarious. And then of course, whoops, let me see if I can just delete this one. There we go. Some changes could not be accepted or rejected because they were contained in controls which are locked for editing. Okay. Not only do you not know which changes are in this situation, there's no resolution other than just to accept your fate that you're never going to be able to accept all the changes in the document. Okay, so content awareness is important, but coming up with good error messages and providing that context to the user is often very, very difficult. Let's talk a little bit about aesthetics. The first rule here really is you do want to be consistent, and consistency is an entirely separate principle, but we also want to make sure that the application has a good look and feel. Artwork and logos make a big difference in terms of the actual look and feel and experience of using an application. That being said, you want to moderate. Less is more. Don't just cover the thing in nothing but artwork and colors and logos and all sorts of craziness. You want them to be meaningful in terms of actually conveying some part of the experience to the user, and consistent, meaning that they're always going to appear in the right locations in a consistent fashion. Color and highlighting can make a huge difference in how someone is able to interact with your application. And this does actually apply even for plain text, because plain text isn't actually plain. I've got a couple of references here. The practicaltypography.com is a very good introduction to typographical design, graphic design, things that you can do with simply plain text to make it easier to read, right? Guiding the user using things that we've learned over the several hundred years since the printing press was invented about how to lay out text in a typeface or in a typesetting environment. And then the second reference here is a book, The Non-Designer's Design Book by Robin Williams. I think there's actually a second edition out now. This is a very good introduction to graphic design if you are not intending to become a graphic designer. It covers all of the basics, all of the main principles with just laying out text. And this is more complicated than you might think. If you haven't ever played around with any of this before, you probably just haven't seen this sort of thing, seen the kinds of errors that cause things to be somewhat more difficult to understand before. And it's important to take a step back and recognize, like, just because I haven't been able to see it and describe it and articulate what the problem is does not necessarily mean that there is no problem, right? Most of the problems that you will see in graphic design are sort of like odd feelings in the back of your head that make it a little bit difficult to understand what's going on. Ambiguousness, some like parts of the text that just don't flow well together. A good example of this would be, I'm sure many of you have read documents that have absolutely no paragraph breaks, just one big, huge, long block of text. It's harder to get through. It's just difficult to follow the thought process when you haven't used good graphic design and layout tools. So don't let aesthetics just be about art and logos. It also includes the layout of the content in text format. You want to be user-focused in your design for the user interfaces. And that does mean understanding everything that the user is doing as they are doing it and knowing what level of detail is actually helpful. It also means understanding their technical background. For example, the no news is good news approach only applies if people understand what the expectation of the technology is, right? For somebody who's never used something before, maybe you want to be a little bit more heavy-handed in terms of providing even responsiveness with good news. How much time are they going to have to spend on inputs and outputs? If they're going to have to spend a lot of time, then maybe that piece of the interface needs to be really well polished. How often is this going to happen? Does it happen every time any change is made to the application, or is it fairly rarely that someone's going to actually be providing input? Basically, how can you design to support what the user is trying to do in the context of what the application is supposed to be addressing? All right, understanding the user is a critical piece, and there's lots and lots of questions that you can ask. I've got a sort of abbreviated list here on this slide and the next of the kinds of things that you would need to be able to understand, need to be able to answer to understand the user. The one example that I end up coming back to quite often is an example in the Canadian court system. So this boldface question, are the users expert typists or keyboard phobic? There was, I think we may have mentioned this at an earlier lecture, but just for the sake of completeness, in the Canadian court system, the circuit court system at the federal level in Canada, they actually do still have traditional circuit courts that travel from one location to another, one community to another, hear court cases, record them and report on them, and then move on to the next location. In the 90s, when computers were becoming a widespread thing, they realized that this could be much more efficient if they were able to just submit all of this stuff electronically. And so they decided, let's upgrade the technology these court reporters are using rather than having a traditional stenographic machine. We'll just give them computers, and then they'll be able to submit reports electronically. The problem was all the stenographers and court reporters did not know how to use a keyboard, right? They were using stenography equipment for a reason. And when the computers were provided to them, it actually hurt the productivity of the court system because they weren't able to take advantage of all of the features that were provided in the computing system, right? That's misunderstanding what the user base is, right? If they're not really able to use the keyboard, then it's not going to be a particularly good thing to give them one, okay? Two other questions that I want to highlight on this list. What are the consequences if the user makes a mistake? Right? Making mistakes happens all the time in every field, and for software systems, the user interface is the first place the user is going to be made aware of those kinds of issues. And you want to make sure they understand the consequences so that when they are using the system, they can be careful or at least take an appropriate level of care in using it. Or frankly, if you want to make it clear that the application is intended to be explored and that mistakes are welcome and easily reversible, that too needs to be communicated to the user. Second question that I really want to highlight here is, do users know about the technology that sits behind the interface, right? Because if you're only designing for novices, then people who are at least somewhat familiar with this sort of technology can feel as if the technology that you've designed for them is holding them back in some way, right? It's not the goal of a computer system to hold people back. You want to provide them a usable interface that gets them as efficient as they can be in the environment that they're in. So make sure that you understand the user as you're designing for them. And designing for the user is actually not easy to do for a variety of reasons. This is a list of other ways that we might consider the users in the design of the process, and this is coming from a previous textbook, not the one that you guys are using for this semester. This is the Pressman Software Engineering textbook. Basically, you want to make sure that the interaction modes, the ways that the user are interacting with the system, are not forced on them, right? That there's only necessary actions and that the user is able to choose when they have to happen, if at all possible. This does mean making sure that things are interruptible or undoable, that the whole process of using the application to produce a result is streamlined in some way, and that you've hidden the technical details from casual users and provided necessary technical details to more technical users. It is a long and involved process figuring out how to understand the user, but once you understand the user, you still have to actually design for them. It is not enough to simply understand them. Designing for the user makes a huge difference. Another important piece of this is understanding what the impact of a default is on the system. If the user has like meaningful defaults for repetitive entry, then that can be much faster than having pointless defaults or defaults that are not easily addressed. Maybe the best improvement in email interfaces has actually been guessing email addresses as recipients for common tasks. That's actually a fairly recent innovation, but I find myself using that all the time. Short-term memory for users is not something that you really want to rely on. If the user needs to be able to see something in order to respond to it, then just put them both on the screen at the same time, if at all possible. If there is some relevant context, remind the user, this is what you decided previously, or this was the last time that you logged in, or anything that might otherwise be problematic from a memory standpoint. It's important to keep that in mind. Again, as you are designing an application, it's easy to forget that all of the stuff that you're working on can be tacit for you and totally new to all of your users. All right, efficiency is the next principle that we need to cover. This does kind of cross-cut everything else that we've been talking about, in particular layout. Right, you want top to bottom, left to right layout, but that's not just a matter of just get a good layout. It's more efficient, right? You can put all the information on the screen in whatever order you want, but the users, most users, at least the Western audience, are going to expect top to bottom, left to right. It's just the way things are. This is more efficient. Grouping related items together, again, you can put them all in random order and space things out, but efficiency makes a big difference in using an application. Again, don't be stingy with the white space. You may want to eliminate typing or provide autocomplete mechanisms or use checkboxes and pull down menus and the appropriate widgets for efficiency purposes and have good default values. It's hard to be efficient though if you haven't already mastered everything else, right? All the other principles that we've talked about, because efficiency is so cross-cutting, they're kind of irrelevant if you don't actually, if efficiency is kind of irrelevant if you don't actually understand all those other principles. Like what does it mean to understand the user and design for the user is really all pulled together in efficiency. One other big point that I would say is that some users really prefer using a keyboard over the mouse. So if at all possible, an important principle in efficiency is to avoid forcing a user to pick one or the other, right? It's often possible to allow for both, and maybe in the case where you're doing both of them in exclusion, you just using the mouse or just using the keyboard, right? Either one is possible for many, many applications, and it's generally more efficient to do it in that manner. All right, so the last slide, human error again. These principles are very, very difficult to follow all the time, but you want to make sure that the human that's using your system doesn't feel like they've just fallen into a pit, that it's their problem, right? Ultimately, we're designing things for them to use, and if we make a mistake, it's our fault, right? It is not the user's error. Don't blame the user. You want to take that blame on yourself as a designer. Okay, so there is actually an activity here associated with this, and I might skip this. Oh, no, this is for the next section, so I'll see you in the next section.